Philosophy of Economics, Second Half, 3. During the past generation, there has been a radical transformation in the attitudes of economists toward empirical causal inquiry, especially in the form of field experiments and natural experiments, often employing instrumental variables. For example, about two-thirds of the articles in the February 2018 American Economic Review are based on empirical studies. The titles of the first four entries in the table of contents are, The Effects of Pretrial Detention on Conviction, Future Crime and Employment, Evidence from Randomly Assigned Judges, Implications of U.S. Tax Policy for House Prices, Rents, and Homeownership, The Welfare Cost of Perceived Policy Uncertainty, Evidence from Social Security, The Economic Consequences of Hospital Admissions. If one goes back 25 years, only about 1/8 of the first issue of the 1993 American Economic Review appear to rely on any empirical studies. The first four entries are, Today's Task for Economists, Trigger Points and Budget Cuts, Explaining the Effects of Fiscal Austerity, Economic Policy, Economic Performance and Elections, The Macroeconomics of Dr. Strangelove. A Rip Van Winkle who had gone to sleep in 1983 reading the principal economics journals would be staggered when he awoke in 2018. Field experiments have been especially important in development economics, where the results of various foreign aid projects have too often provided meager benefits. One can find good introductions to this work in Carpenter et al., 2005, Duflo and Banerjee, 2011, 2017, Gugarty and Carlin, 2018, Carlin and Appel, 2011, 2016, Creamer and Glenerstier, 2011, List and Samak, 2018, and Mullинathan and Schaefer, 2013. See also the Poverty Action Lab. Although field experiments appear to be hard-nosed inquiries that establish what works and what does not work, matters are not so simple. Deaton 2010, Cartwright and Hardy 2013. Without knowledge of the mechanisms, it is all too easy for an intervention that works splendidly at a specific time and place to fail abysmally when tried elsewhere. 8. Theoretical inquiry, even when methodologically sophisticated, has severe limits as a tactic of knowledge acquisition. The empirical turn in economics has also had the effect of increasing the importance of economic history. With some ingenuity, especially in identifying possible instrumental variables, history is full of natural experiments. For example, J. Hausman 2016, in 1936, the American Congress voted to pay pensions to veterans of World War I 8 years before they were due to be paid. Because the percentages of veterans differed across states, Hausman can use the differing economic performances of states to estimate the effects of the economic stimulus the pensions provided. Although less decisive than randomized controlled trials, which are often impossible to carry out, examination of historical episodes such as this one provides significant evidence concerning economic hypotheses. 5. Rational choice theory. Insofar as economics explains and predicts phenomena as consequences of individual choices, which are themselves explained in terms of alleged reasons, it must depict agents as to some extent rational. Rationality, like reasons, involves evaluation, and just as one can assess the rationality of individual choices, so one can assess the rationality of social choices and examine how they are and ought to be related to the preferences and judgments of individuals. In addition, there are intricate questions concerning rationality in strategic situations in which outcomes depend on the choices of multiple individuals. Since rationality is a central concept in branches of philosophy such as action theory, epistemology, ethics, and philosophy of mind, studies of rationality frequently cross the boundaries between economics and philosophy. 5.1 Individual rationality. The bare-bones theory of rationality discussed above in section 1.1 takes an agent's preferences, rankings of states of affairs, to be rational if they are complete and transitive, and it takes the agent's choice to be rational if the agent does not prefer any feasible alternative to the one he or she chooses. Such a theory of rationality is clearly too weak, because it says nothing about belief or what rationality implies when agents do not know, with certainty, everything relevant to their choices. But it may also be too strong, since, as Isaac Levi in particular has argued, 1986, there is nothing irrational about having incomplete preferences in situations involving uncertainty. Sometimes it is rational to suspend judgment and to refuse to rank alternatives that are not well understood. On the other hand, transitivity is a plausible condition, and the so-called money pump argument demonstrates that if one's preferences are intransitive and one is willing to make exchanges, then one can be exploited. Suppose an agent A prefers X to Y, Y to Z and Z to X, and that A will pay some small amount of money $P to exchange Y for X, Z for Y, and X for Z. That means that, starting with Z, A will pay $P for Y, then $P again for X, then $P again for Z and so on. Agents are not this stupid. They will instead refuse to trade or adjust their preferences to eliminate the intransitivity, but see Schick 1986. On the other hand, there is considerable experimental evidence that people's preferences are not in fact transitive. Such evidence does not establish that transitivity is not a requirement of rationality. It may show instead that people are sometimes irrational. In the case of so-called preference reversals, for example, it seems plausible that people in fact make irrational choices, Lichtenstein and Slovic 1971, Tversky and Thaler 1990. Evidence of persistent violations of transitivity is disquieting, since standards of rationality should not be impossibly high. A further difficulty with the bare-bones theory of rationality concerns the individuation of the objects of preference or choice. Consider, for example, data from multistage ultimatum games. Suppose A can propose any division of $10 between A and B. B can accept or reject A's proposal. If B rejects the proposal, then the amount of money drops to $5, and B gets to offer a division of the $5 which A can accept or reject. If A rejects B's offer, then both players get nothing. Suppose that A proposes to divide the money with $7 for A and $3 for B. B declines and offers to split the $5 evenly, with $2.50 for each. Behavior such as this is, in fact, common, Oakes and Roth 1989, p. 362. Assuming that B prefers more money to less, these choices appear to be a violation of transitivity. B prefers $3 to $2.50, yet declines $3 for certain for $2.50, with some slight chance of A declining and B getting nothing. But the objects of choice are not just quantities of money. B is turning down $3 as part of a raw deal in favor of $2.50 as part of a fair arrangement. If the objects of choice are defined in this way, there is no failure of transitivity. This plausible observation gives rise to a serious problem. Unless there are constraints on how the objects of choice are individuated, conditions of rationality such as transitivity are empty. A's choice of X over Y, Y over Z and Z over X does not violate transitivity if X when the alternative is Y is not the same object of choice as X when the alternative is Z. John Broome, 1991, argues that further substantive principles of rationality are required to limit how alternatives are individuated or to require that agents be indifferent between alternatives such as X when the alternative is Y and X when the alternative is Z. To extend the theory of rationality to circumstances involving risk, where the objects of choice are lotteries with known probabilities, and uncertainty, where agents do not know the probabilities or even all the possible outcomes of their choices, requires further principles of rationality, as well as controversial technical simplifications. Subjective Bayesians suppose that individuals in circumstances of uncertainty have well-defined subjective probabilities, degrees of belief, over all the payoffs, and thus that the objects of choice can be modeled as lotteries, just as in circumstances involving risk, though with subjective probabilities in place of objective probabilities. See the entries on Bayes' theorem and Bayesian epistemology. The most important of the axioms needed for the theory of rational choice under conditions of risk and uncertainty is the independence condition. It says roughly that the preferences of rational agent between two lotteries that differ in only one outcome should match their preferences between the differing outcomes. Although initially plausible, the independence condition is very controversial. See Alice and Hagen, 1979, and McLennan, 1983, 1990. A considerable part of rational choice theory is concerned with formalizations of conditions of rationality and investigation of their implications. When an agent's preferences are complete and transitive and satisfy a further continuity condition, then they can be represented by a so-called ordinal utility function. What this means is that it is possible to define a function that represents an agent's preferences so that u, x, is greater than u, y, if and only if the agent prefers x to y, and u, x, equals u, y, if and only if the agent is indifferent between x and y. This function merely represents the preference ranking. It contains no information beyond the ranking. Any order-preserving transformation of u would represent the agent's preferences just as well. When an agent's preferences in addition satisfy the independence condition and some other technical conditions, then they can be represented by an expected utility function, Harsanyi 1977b, Chapter 4, Herrnstein and Milnor 1953, Ramsey 1926, and Savage 1972. Such a function has two important properties. First, the expected utility of a lottery is equal to the sum of the expected utilities of its prizes weighted by their probabilities. Second, expected utility functions are unique up to a positive affine transformation. What this means is that if u and v are both expected utility functions representing the preferences of an agent, then for all objects of preference, x, the function v of x, must be equal to a times the function u of x, plus b, where a and b are real numbers and a is positive. In addition, the axioms of rationality imply that the agent's degrees of belief will satisfy the axioms of the probability calculus. A great deal of controversy surrounds the theory of rationality, and there have been many formal investigations into weakened or amended theories of rationality. For further discussion, see Alice and Hagen 1979, Barber, Hammond and Seidel 1999, Kahneman and Tversky 1979, Looms and Sugden 1982, Luce and Rafa 1957, Machina 1987, and Gilboa and Schmeidler 2001. However, the individual market participants/agents do not have to be rational in order for market economies to be rational. In other words, the rationality of the agents in an economy would be a sufficient condition to ensure the soundness of neoclassical economic analysis, but it is not a necessary condition. Taken together, two landmark papers in economic theory which were published before the field of behavioral economics emerged. The first is the paper Uncertainty, Evolution, and Economic Theory by Armin Alchin from 1950, and the second is the paper Irrational Behavior and Economic Theory from 1962 by Gary Becker, both of which were published in the Journal of Political Economy, provide a justification for standard neoclassical economic analysis. Alchin's 1950 paper uses the logic of natural selection, the evolutionary landscape model, stochastic processes, probability theory, and several other lines of reasoning to justify many of the results derived from standard supply analysis, assuming firms which maximizing their profits, are certain about the future, and have accurate foresight without having to assume any of those things. Becker's 1962 paper shows that downward sloping market demand curves, the most important implication of the law of demand, do not actually require an assumption that the consumers in that market are rational, as is claimed by behavioral economists, and they also follow from a wide variety of irrational behavior as well. The lines of reasoning and argumentation used in these two papers is re-expressed and expanded upon in, at least, one other professional economic publication for each of them. As for Alchin's evolutionary economics via natural selection by way of environmental adoption thesis, it is summarized, followed by an explicit exploration of its theoretical implications for behavioral economic theory, then illustrated via examples in several different industries including banking, hospitality, and transportation, in the 2014 paper Uncertainty, Evolution, and Behavioral Economic Theory, by Mann and Zawicki. And the argument made in Becker's 1962 paper, that a pure increase in the relative price, or terms of trade, of good X must reduce the amount of X demanded in the market for good X, is explained in greater detail in chapters, or as he calls them, lectures, because this textbook is more or less a transcription of his lectures given in his price theory course taught to first-year PhD students several years earlier, 4, called The Opportunity Set, and 5, called Substitution Effects, of Gary. Becker's graduate-level textbook Economic Theory, originally published in 1971. 5.2 Collective Rationality and Social Choice. Although societies are very different from individuals, they have mechanisms to evaluate alternatives and make choices, and their evaluations and choices may be rational or irrational. It is not, however, obvious what principles of rationality should govern the choices and evaluations of society. Transitivity is one plausible condition. It seems that a society that chooses X when faced with the alternatives X or Y, Y when faced with the alternatives Y or Z, and Z when faced with the alternatives X or Z either has had a change of heart or is choosing irrationally. Yet, purported irrationalities such as these can easily arise from standard mechanisms that aim to link social choices and individual preferences. Suppose there are 3 individuals in the society. Individual 1 ranks the alternatives X, Y, Z. Individual 2 ranks them Y, Z, X. Individual 3 ranks them Z, X, Y. If decisions are made by pairwise majority voting, X will be chosen from the pair, X, Y, Y will be chosen from, Y, Z, and Z will be chosen from, X, Z. Clearly this is unsettling, but are possible cycles in social choices irrational? Similar problems affect what one might call the logical coherence of social judgments, List and Pettit 2002. Suppose society consists of 3 individuals who make the following judgments concerning the truth or falsity of the propositions P and Q, and that social judgment follows the majority. The judgments of each of the individuals are consistent with the principles of logic, while social judgments violate them. How important is it that social judgments be consistent with the principles of logic? Although social choice theory in this way bears on questions of social rationality, most work in social choice theory explores the consequences of principles of rationality coupled with explicitly ethical constraints. The seminal contribution is Kenneth Arrow's Impossibility Theorem, 1963, 1967. Arrow assumes that both individual preferences and social preferences are complete and transitive, and that the method of forming social preferences, or making social choices, issues in some social preference ranking or social choice for any possible profile of individual preferences. In addition, Arrow imposes a weak unanimity condition: if everybody prefers X to Y, then Y must not be socially preferred. Third, he requires that there be no dictator whose preferences determine social preferences or choices irrespective of the preferences of anybody else. Lastly, he imposes the condition that the social preference between X and Y should depend on how individuals rank X and Y and on nothing else. Arrow then proved the surprising result that no method of relating social and individual preferences can satisfy all these conditions. In the 60 years since Arrow wrote, there has been a plethora of work in social choice theory, a good deal of which is arguably of great importance to ethics. For example, John Harsanyi proved that if individual preferences and social evaluations both satisfy the axioms of expected utility theory, with shared or objective probabilities, and that social preferences conform to unanimous individual preferences, then social evaluations are determined by a weighted sum of individual utilities, 1955, 1977a. Matthew Adler, 2012, has extended an approach like Harsanyi's to demonstrate that a form of weighted utilitarianism, which prioritizes the interests of those who are worse off, uniquely satisfies a longer list of rational and ethical constraints. When there are instead disagreements in probability assignments, there is an impossibility result. The unanimity condition implies that for some profiles of individual preferences, social evaluations will not satisfy the axioms of expected utility theory. Hammond 1983, Seidenfeld, et al. 1989, Mongan 1995. For further discussion of social choice theory and the relevance of utility theory to social evaluation, see the entry on social choice theory, Sen, 1970, and for recent reappraisals Flerby, 2007, and Adler, 2012. 5.3 Game theory. When outcomes depend on what several agents do, one agent's best choice may depend on what other agents choose. Although the principles of rationality governing individual choice still apply, arguably there are further principles of rationality governing expectations of the actions of others, and of their expectations concerning your actions and expectations, and so forth. Game theory occupies an increasingly important role within economics, and it is also relevant both to inquiries concerning rationality and inquiries concerning ethics. For further discussion see the entries on game theory and ethics, and evolutionary game theory. 6. Economics and ethics. As discussed above in section 2.1, most economists distinguish between positive and normative economics, and most would argue that economics is relevant to policy mainly because of the positive information it provides concerning the consequences of policy. Yet the same economists also offer their advice concerning how to fix the economy, and there is a whole field of normative economics. Economic outcomes, institutions, and processes may be better or worse in several different ways. Some outcomes may make people better off. Other outcomes may be less unequal. Others may restrict individual freedom more severely. Economists typically evaluate outcomes exclusively in terms of welfare. This does not imply that they believe that only welfare is of moral importance. They focus on welfare, because they believe that economics provides an excellent set of tools to address questions of welfare, and because they hope that questions about welfare can be separated from questions about equality, freedom, or justice. As sketched below, economists have had some things to say about other dimensions of moral appraisal, but welfare takes center stage. Indeed, normative economics is standardly called welfare economics. 6.1 Welfare. One central question of moral philosophy has been to determine what things are intrinsically good for human beings. This is a central question, because all plausible moral views assign an important place to individual welfare or well-being. This is obviously true of utilitarianism, which holds that what is right maximizes total or average welfare, but even non-utilitarian views are concerned with welfare, if they recognize the virtue of benevolence, or if they are concerned with the interests of individuals or with avoiding harm to individuals. There are many ways to think about well-being, and the prevailing view among economists has shifted from hedonism, which takes the good to be a mental state such as pleasure or happiness, to the view that welfare should be measured by the satisfaction of preferences. A number of prominent economists are currently arguing for a return to hedonism, but they remain a minority. See Babita et al. 2014. Clark F. L. Che 2018, Dolan and Kahneman 2014, Frey 2010, 2018, Frey and Stutzer 2001, Kahneman 1999, 2000A, 2000B, Kahneman and Kruger 2006, Kahneman and Sugden 2005, Kahneman and Thaler 2006, Laird 2006, Ormerod 2008, Radcliffe 2013, Wieman and Nabe 2015, and for criticism Davies 2015, Etzioni 2018, and Hausman 2010. Unlike hedonism, taking welfare to be preference satisfaction specifies how to find out what is good for a person rather than committing itself to any substantive view of a person's good. Note that equating welfare with the satisfaction of preferences is not equating welfare with any feeling of satisfaction. If welfare can be measured by the satisfaction of preferences, then a person is better off if what he or she prefers comes to pass, regardless of whether that occurrence makes the agent feel satisfied. Since mainstream economics attributes a consistent preference ordering to all agents, and since more specific models typically take agents to be well-informed and self-interested, it is easy for economists to accept the view that an individual agent A will prefer X to Y if and only if X is in fact better for A than Y is. This is one place where positive theory bleeds into normative theory. In addition, the identification of welfare with the satisfaction of preferences is attractive to economists, because it prevents questions about the justification of paternalism, to which most economists are strongly opposed, from even arising. Welfare and the satisfaction of preferences may coincide because the satisfaction of preferences constitutes welfare, or because people are self-interested and good judges of their own interests and hence prefer what is good for them. There are many obvious objections to the view that the satisfaction of preferences constitutes welfare. Preferences may be based on mistaken beliefs. People may prefer to sacrifice their own well-being for some purpose they value more highly. Preferences may reflect past manipulation or distorting psychological influences, Elster 1983. In addition, if preference satisfaction constitutes welfare, then policymakers can make people better off by molding their wants rather than by improving conditions. Furthermore, it seems unreasonable that social policy should attend to extravagant preferences. Rather than responding to these objections and attempting to defend the view that preference satisfaction constitutes well-being, economists can blunt these objections by taking preferences in circumstances where people are self-interested and good judges of their interests to be merely good evidence of what will promote welfare. Hausman and McPherson 2009, Hausman 2012. There are some exceptions, most notably Amartya Sen, 1987 ABC, 1992, but most economists take welfare to coincide with the satisfaction of preference. 6.2 Efficiency. Because the identification of welfare with preference satisfaction makes it questionable whether one can make interpersonal welfare comparisons, few economists defend a utilitarian view of policy as maximizing total or average welfare. Harsanyi is one exception, for another CNG 1983. Economists have instead explored the possibility of making welfare assessments of economic processes, institutions, outcomes, and policies without making interpersonal comparisons. Consider two economic outcomes S and R, and suppose that some people prefer S to R and that nobody prefers R to S. In that case S is Pareto superior to R, or S is a Pareto improvement over R. Without making any interpersonal comparisons, one can conclude that people's preferences are better satisfied in S than in R. If there is no state of affairs that is Pareto superior to S, then economists say that S is Pareto optimal or Pareto efficient. Efficiency here is efficiency with respect to satisfying preferences rather than minimizing the number of inputs needed to produce a unit of output or some other technical notion, L. E. Grand 1991. If a state of affairs is not Pareto efficient, then society is missing an opportunity costlessly to satisfy some people's preferences better. A Pareto efficient state of affairs avoids this failure, but it has no other obvious virtues. For example, suppose nobody is satiated and people care only about how much food they get. Consider two distributions of food. In the first, millions are starving but no food is wasted. In the second, nobody is starving, but some food is wasted. The first is Pareto efficient, while the second is not. The notions of Pareto improvements and Pareto efficiency might seem useless, because economic policies almost always have both winners and losers. Mainstream economists have nevertheless found these concepts useful in two ways. First, they have proved two theorems concerning properties of perfectly competitive equilibria, Arrow 1968. The first theorem says that equilibria in perfectly competitive markets are Pareto optimal, and the second says that any Pareto optimal allocation, with whatever distribution of income policymakers might prefer, can be achieved as a perfectly competitive market equilibrium, provided that one begins with just the right distribution of endowments among economic agents. The first theorem has been regarded as underwriting Adam Smith's view of the invisible hand, Arrow and Hahn 1971, Preface, Hahn 1973. This interpretation is problematic, because no economy has ever been or will ever be in perfectly competitive equilibrium. The second theorem provides some justification for the normative division of labor economists prefer, with economists concerned about efficiency and others concerned about justice. The thought is that the second theorem shows that theories of just distribution are compatible with reliance on competitive markets. The two fundamental theorems of welfare economics go some way toward explaining why mainstream economists, whether they support laissez-faire policies or government intervention to remedy market imperfections, think of perfectly competitive equilibria as ideals. But the significance of the theorems is debatable, since actual markets differ significantly from perfectly competitive markets and, when there are multiple market imperfections, the theory of the second best shows that fixing some of the imperfections may lead the society away from a perfectly competitive equilibrium, and diminish efficiency and welfare, rather than toward one, Lipsey and Lancaster 1956-7. The other way that economists have found to extend the Pareto efficiency notions leads to cost-benefit analysis, which is a practical tool for policy analysis, Mission 1971, Sugden and Williams 1978, Adler and Posner 2006, Broadman et al. 2010, Bodway 2016. Suppose that S is not a Pareto improvement over R. Some members of the society would be losers in a shift from R to S. Those losers prefer R to S, but there are enough winners, enough people who prefer S to R, that the winners could compensate the losers and make the preference for S with compensation paid, over R unanimous. S is a potential Pareto improvement over R. In other terms, the amount of money the winners would be willing to pay to bring about the change is larger than the amount of money the losers would have to be compensated so as not to object to the change. Economists are skeptical about what one learns from asking people how much they would be willing to pay, and they attempt instead to infer how much individuals are willing to pay indirectly from market phenomena. When S is a potential Pareto improvement over R, there is said to be a net benefit to the policy of bringing about S. According to cost-benefit analysis, among eligible policies, which satisfy legal and moral constraints, one should, other things being equal, employ the one with the largest net benefit. Note that the compensation is entirely hypothetical. Potential Pareto improvements result in winners and losers, the justice or injustice of which is irrelevant to cost-benefit analysis. Justice or beneficence may require that the society do something to mitigate distributional imbalances. Because there is a larger pie of goods and services to satisfy preferences, since compensation could be paid and everybody's preferences better satisfied, selecting policies with the greatest net benefit serves economic efficiency, Hicks 1939, Kaldor 1939. Despite the practical importance of cost-benefit analysis, the technique and the justification for it sketched in the previous paragraph are problematic. One technical difficulty is that it is possible for S to be a potential Pareto improvement over R and for R to be a potential Pareto improvement over S, Saitovsky 1941, Samuelson 1950. That means that the fact that S is a potential Pareto improvement over R does not imply that there is a larger economic pie in S than in R, because there cannot, of course, be a larger economic pie in S than in R and a larger economic pie in R than in S. A second problem is that willingness to pay for some policy and the amount one would require in compensation if one opposes the policy depend on how much wealth one has as well as on one's attitude to the policy. Cost-benefit analysis weights the preferences of the rich more than the preferences of the poor, Baker 1975. It is possible to compensate roughly for the effects of income and wealth, Harberger 1978, Fankhauser et al. 1997, but it is bothersome to do so, and cost-benefit analysis is commonly employed without any adjustment for wealth or income. A further serious difficulty for traditional welfare economics, which has been as it were hiding in plain sight, is the fact that choices are imperfect indicators of preferences, which are in turn imperfect indicators of what enhances well-being. The same facts that show that preference satisfaction does not constitute well-being, false beliefs, lack of information, other directed and non-rational preferences, show that choices and preferences are sometimes misleading indicators of well-being. Moreover, once one recognizes that preferences are good indicators of welfare only if agents are good judges of what will benefit them, one is bound to recognize that agents are not always good judges of what will benefit themselves, even when they have all the information they need. In some contexts, these problems may be minor. For example, people's preferences among new automobiles are largely self-interested, thoughtful, and well-informed. In other contexts, such as environmental protection, preferences for ignoring the problems are often badly informed, while preferences to take action are typically not self-interested. Either way, popular preferences among policies to address environmental problems are unlikely to be a good guide to welfare. Ignoring these problems has been a great convenience to normative economics. If what people choose reveals their preferences, which in turn indicate what is good for them, then, as noted before, government action to steer someone's choices can never make that person better off, and so questions about whether to endorse paternalistic policies cannot arise. But whether or not it is advisable, successful paternalism is not impossible, and recent work by behavioral economists, which document a wide variety of systematic deliberative foibles, has put questions concerning paternalism back on the table. Arely 2009, Kahneman 2011. Some economists have searched for ways to identify an agent's true preferences, as described by Infante et al. 2016. Others have argued that policymakers must respect the preferences of agents among their ends or objectives, while overruling preferences among means when these are distorted by bad judgment or false beliefs. Thaler and Sunstein 2008. Le Grand and New 2015. Moreover, Thaler and Sunstein's proposal that government explore non-coercive methods of influencing people to make better choices, nudges, has been popular among policymakers and has arguably shifted philosophical discussion of paternalism away from Mill's 1859, focus on avoiding coercion, Schifrin 2000, Hausman and Welch 2010, Le Grand and New 2015. 6.3 Other directions in normative economics. Although welfare economics and concerns about efficiency dominate normative economics, they do not exhaust the subject, and in collaboration with philosophers, economists have made important contributions to contemporary work in ethics and normative social and political philosophy. Section 5.2 and Section 5.3 gave some hint of the contributions of social choice theory and game theory. In addition, economists and philosophers have worked on the problem of providing a formal characterization of freedom so as to bring tools of economic analysis to bear. Patnaik and Su 1990, Sen 1988, 1990, 1991, Carter 1999, Sugden 2018. Others have developed formal characterizations of social welfare functions that prioritize the interests of those who are less well off or that favor equality of resources, opportunity, and outcomes and that separate individual and social responsibility for inequalities. Posner and Schmeidler 1974, Varian 1974, 1975, Romer 1986b, 1987, Fleurby 1995, 2008, Fleurby and Manicki 2014, Greaves 2015, McCarthy 2015, 2017. John Romer has put contemporary economic modeling to work to offer precise characterizations of exploitation. 1982. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have not only developed novel interpretations of the proper concerns of normative economics in terms of capabilities, Sen 1992, Nussbaum and Sen 1993, Nussbaum 2000, which Sen has linked to characterizations of egalitarianism and to operational measures of deprivation, 1999. There are many lively interactions between normative economics and moral philosophy. See also the entries on libertarianism, paternalism, egalitarianism, and economics, normative and economic justice. 7. Conclusions. The frontiers between economics and philosophy concerned with methodology, rationality, ethics, and normative social and political philosophy are buzzing with activity. This activity is diverse and concerned with very different questions. Although many of these are related, philosophy of economics is not a single unified enterprise. It is a collection of separate inquiries linked to one another by connections among the questions and by the dominating influence of mainstream economic models and techniques. The end.